Greetings, comrade! Today I'm going to give you a crash course on all things revolutionary. My fellow workers, prepare for a ride through genocide and lurch toward a purge, because we're talking about communism. When the Industrial Revolution swept through Europe, the conditions in the new factories were horrific, and the workers were subject to mistreatment and overwork at the hands of rich factory owners. This led to revolutionary sentiments, with it all coming to a head in 1848 in what is called the Spring of Nations. Many of these revolutions failed, but out of that fire came a revolutionary movement that would bring the concept of revolution to an entire new level. Karl Marx was born in 1818, and in 1848, the year of revolution, he published a book called the Communist Manifesto. This book would become the Bible for the religion of communism, and it would set the template. Marx states that all of history is class struggle between the rich, or bourgeoisie, and the poor, or proletariat. The bourgeoisie always exploits the proletariat by making them workers. Thus, according to Marx, these workers of the world must unite and rise up in a revolution that overthrows the bourgeoisie and forms a classless society. According to Marx, communism is a natural progression of society, but it can only be achieved in an industrial capitalist society. A non-industrial or non-capitalist society would have a hard time achieving communism. When Marx died in 1883, there had been no major successful communist revolutions, but in November of 1917, that would all change. Vladimir Lenin had extreme views of Marxist ideology, but his mark would create modern communism. Lenin argued that the revolution had to be violent, drawing ire from figures like Karl Kautsky, the father of modern democratic socialism. Lenin also believed that communism and capitalism were both stages in societal evolution, with communism being the natural stage after capitalism, and that all capitalist countries were destined to fall to communism. It is important to note that all modern communists are Marxist-Leninists. According to Lenin, the first stage of capitalism is monopoly, where everything is bank-controlled, followed by imperialism, where capitalist countries seek to expand capitalism and exploit others. Lenin believed capitalism would eventually fail, and the first stage of communism, which he calls socialism, which ironically isn't the basis of the ideology of socialism, which goes back to Thomas More, and I know that's confusing, but so is ideology. In Lenin's version of socialism, a dictatorship of the proletariat would be set up, and the rich would be stripped of their belongings. Following this would be the most important part of Leninism, collectivization, where personal property is consolidated by the state, and in theory, redistributed equally to the people. Lenin died before achieving his goals, however. Following the death of Lenin, two figures would come to define communist thought and would become bitter rivals. Joseph Stalin and Leon Trotsky were polar opposites with clashing worldviews. Trotsky believed that if revolution could be successful in Russia, it could be successful elsewhere, and wanted a policy of permanent revolution. Trotsky thought that once rich countries turned communist, they would provide aid to Russia. He was against collectivization in favor of more rapid industrialization, and hoped to end the much-hated Russian bureaucracy that permeated Russian politics. Meanwhile, Stalin believed in what he called socialism in one country, and wanted to make sure that even if communist ideology died elsewhere, it would survive in Russia. In practice, this was done via purges, and many disappeared or were sent to Siberian gulags. Stalin was for collectivization, and used the Russian bureaucracy to obtain and hold power. Only one of these men could lead the fledgling USSR, and it would be Stalin with his ruthless politics. Leon Trotsky would later be murdered in Mexico by Stalin's assassins. Later, Stalin's purges would even be brought to the Spanish Republic in its civil war, and even famous author George Orwell found himself on the wrong side of a purge whilst fighting Franco's fascists, but escaped to France. He wrote on it in his seminal work Homage to Catalonia. While communism caused for revolution among industrial workers, that class was fairly small in the early 20th century China. However, Mao Zedong was able to achieve a communist revolution among the peasantry before the industrial workers were even involved. Mao went against the predominant views of communists and achieved a communist revolution in a non-industrial country. This came with its own problems, however, and Chairman Mao stressed a unifying culture between industrial and non-industrial workers. At the height of his power, a pamphlet called Quotations from Chairman Mao Zedong, which has been nicknamed the Little Red Book, was widely distributed. Another aspect of Maoism is that of the two-line struggle, which represents the conflicting interests of the proletariat and bourgeoisie based off of lifestyle. But even if one acts in a bourgeois way, it doesn't mean that they're bourgeoisie. Mao attempted rapid industrialization in the Great Leap Forward, but that failed miserably in famine that killed tens of millions, and his cultural revolution led to revolts that had to be violently put down. Karl Marx, Friedrich Engels, Vladimir Lenin, Joseph Stalin, and Mao Zedong are the largest contributors to the ideology of communism, but there are many minor figures that trace their inspiration from those mentioned. One of these such figures is Kim Il-sung, who took Stalinism to its extremes with his Juche ideology. In Juche, or self-reliance, it's not just you, but your whole extended family being sent to the Gulag. The Suryong, or supreme leader's word is law, and none can go against him. Juche states that the masses of the people are the primary motivation for revolution and construction, but in practice this only led to famine, xenophobia, and isolationism until recently. The three major aspects that define Juche are ideological autonomy, economic self-sufficiency, and military independence from imperial influence, but mostly the US. How much of Kim Il-sung's original ideology is still practiced, though, can be debated. Another disciple of Stalin was Fidel Castro, but his style of government included many of the traits of the caudillo, or strongman. Castro was a central figure of his regime, and his word stood above that of the legislature. He also demonized America as imperialists and was completely against capitalist influence. Castro believed the welfare of the community overtook that of the individual and preached moral incentives overtake material concerns in the minds of the workers. When the Soviet Union collapsed and aid stopped coming, Castro chose to let his people starve and infrastructure collapse instead of allowing capitalist influence, and Cuba suffered for it. In contrast to Castro, Ho Chi Minh is known as the liberator of Vietnam. While others turned to communism for power, Ho Chi Minh turned to communism to achieve freedom from French imperialism. He saw the struggle between capitalists and communists as that of imperialists versus anti-imperialists, and wanted Western influences to leave his nation no matter the source. Ho Chi Minh famously stated he only followed one party, the Vietnamese party. He emphasized legislature and the National Assembly, and to this day, the Vietnamese legislature holds the true power in Vietnam. The Khmer Rouge is what happens when communist ideologies fall into the hands of a completely sick individual. Pol Pot was one of the worst madmen of the 20th century, and his Maoist genocide would bring communism to its extremes. He advocated an extreme form of collectivization, where city dwellers were forced out of their cities, and all members of society would be poor agricultural workers. Children as young as 8 were taken from their parents to indoctrination camps, and all aspects of life were subject to regulation, from how you looked to who you married. If you didn't comply, you were either taken to a political prison and tortured, or to the killing fields, where you could guess what happened next. The Khmer Rouge collapsed when Vietnam invaded and fled into the jungle, but they left a harsh scar in Cambodia's population and national psyche. The death toll of communism worldwide is estimated to be over 100 million, but accurate numbers are hard to reach and up for debate. In Mao's China, it's 65 million. In Stalin's USSR, 20 million. 2 million in both North Korea and in Khmer Rouge, Cambodia. 1 million in Eastern Europe and Vietnam. 1.7 million in Ethiopia. And 1.5 million in Afghanistan. And up to 150,000 throughout Latin America. While communism's ideology is utopian, it has always led to dystopia in practice. There is a reason many communist nations have to keep secret police and monitor their populations. Many communist nations like China and Vietnam have had to open themselves up to capitalist elements or risk collapsing just like the USSR did in '92. However, communism is not dead, nor is it dying, and there are plenty of communist movements around the world. Okay, comrades, now you have all the knowledge you need to go out in revolution. I'm not telling you to do that, by the way. So remember, don't remember my name when you start your purge, and we're all workers here. Thanks for watching.